Dit is Dublin, Ierland. Door het instorten van de huizenmarkt verkeerde het land de afgelopen jaren in crisis. Dit had veel gevolgen voor het land. Een van die gevolgen was het ontstaan van de zogenaamde spookwijken, ook al ghost estates genoemd. We gaan op bezoek bij econoom Ronan Lyons. Hij geeft les aan de Trinity University in Dublin en is een specialist op het gebied van de Ierse huizenmarkt.
Well, in Ireland, the ghost estate refers to a particular kind of development. Typically, it's in rural areas, away from the major centres of population, and it was an estate that was built, a housing estate that was built particularly in the 5 years up to 2007, 2008. And almost all of them were in some way driven by tax incentives as well. So when you say a ghost estate to an Irish person, they straight away have an idea in their head of a large estate in a rural area, and the only reason it ever got built was because somebody was getting a tax break.
De spookwijken zijn dus vooral op het platteland te vinden. De provincie Leitrim is zo'n plattelandstreek. Het gebied is even groot als de provincie Utrecht en heeft maar 32.000 inwoners. Wij gaan er naartoe om een kijkje te nemen.
But a lot of the areas designated for in need of regeneration were rural hinterlands, in particular in the northwest around Leitrim.
Om een duidelijk beeld van het probleem te krijgen, moeten we bij het begin beginnen. We gaan terug naar de jaren 90.
Up until 1995, more or less, the Irish economy had been pretty stable or static and not very developed either. So relative to the Netherlands or to Germany, incomes would have been a good bit lower and unemployment would have been a lot higher. From 95 to 2001, there was really rapid growth, particularly in the numbers of people at work. And a lot of this was healthy economic growth. Some of it was catch-up with places like the Netherlands and Germany. And a lot of it was driven by investment from American firms into Ireland. That's the healthy period, the boom period. The bubble period started shortly after that, say 2001. It had been emerging really from this new expectation that things were going to get better and they were going to continue to get better. What it meant was that banks were willing to lend and homeowners are willing to borrow excessive amounts relative to what a home was actually worth. And indeed developers got caught up in the same thing as well, building estates that people didn't really want. And that period lasted from 2001 to about 2007. Its end really was inevitable once the US housing market turned in 2005, 2006, that was going to spread at some point through a very globalized financial system. And when the European Central Bank started to increase interest rates in 2006, 2007, a lot of Irish people had been on these tracker mortgages with very low interest rates. They went up, and then all of a sudden the party music stopped and people realized that there were all these homes that nobody really wanted. So since 2007, really to 2012, it was year after year of things getting worse.
Op de Universiteit van Maynooth, net buiten Dublin, spreken we professor Rob Kitchen. Hij vertelt dat de crisis eigenlijk onvermijdelijk was.
The crisis here might have been partially triggered by the global financial crisis, but we probably would have always had a crisis because we were overbuilding. So our banks didn't collapse because of the global financial crisis. In a sense, they collapsed because of the property crisis here of too much supply as opposed to demand.
Midden in de provincie Leitrim ligt het dorpje Cashcarrigan. Hier wonen ongeveer 450 mensen, maar er staan meer dan 100 huizen leeg. Een van de mensen die in dit gebied huizen verkoopt is makelaar Liam Farrell.
It arose as an excess of development, I suppose on foot of what happened in Ireland, the huge boom in the economy, the Celtic Tiger, meant that there was tremendous growth and that effectively immigration from the country effectively stopped or was stemmed, and there was obviously huge migration into Ireland as well. from Eastern Europe and indeed all parts of Europe. And that combined with the easy supply of credit, of money, and a relatively low interest rate environment meant that property became the asset class of choice for pretty much everyone. A classic bubble, a frenzy developed, and in the end I suppose a lot of locations, some rural locations that really didn't have critical mass or any great population, they were the subject of significant development which wasn't sustainable in the long term.
Building houses is that's not a solution. That can help. It can drive down the cost of your accommodation and try and attract people in, but it doesn't address the underlying issue that if you're not close to a big city, it's tough for an area to create jobs. And I think the motivation may have been right. Let's make sure that the Northwest doesn't lose out on the boom. The implementation was poor.
De bewoners van Kishkergan willen niet voor de camera reageren. Niemand wil een ander de schuld geven en men wil in de kleine gemeenschap niet bekend staan als degene die met de pers heeft gepraat. Er zouden namelijk mensen uit die gemeenschap betrokken kunnen zijn bij de bouwprojecten. Verder lijkt er een soort van schaamte te zijn voor de leegstaande huizen.
It's a difficult, I suppose, question to answer. I think that there's a number of things. I'm sure in a lot of cases that development in Kesh, and I don't specifically, I suppose, pinpoint that in a lot of small towns and villages where there is unfinished houses or what have you, there probably was local people involved in that, in the construction of it, working on it, developing it, etc. So I suppose it can be, it's perhaps not a great word, it's not a sore topic, but I suppose yes, it could be a sensitive topic. I think maybe initially it probably was in the first years of the downturn, going back maybe 6-7 years ago, when all this happened and everything unfolded, and there was no roadmap, and nobody really knew how deep this recession or depression would be. I think it was very difficult then.
Drumshanbo, een dorpje 10 kilometer verderop, heeft 1000 inwoners. Hier vinden we ook een aantal ghost estates. Een van die wijken heet Knock-on-Leer, wat berg van goud betekent. Deze wijk is voor de helft bewoond. En we vinden er een bewoner die wel met ons wil praten.
It's not. I mean, compared to a lot of estates, this estate isn't too bad. I mean, there's a lot worse around. So this is quite a tidy area. And to be fair, a majority of the estate is occupied. I mean, there are others where there's only 1 or 2 houses in a whole street that have got people in them. But I suppose the annoying thing is a lot of common land and things there that should be opened up. There's a lot of kids that live around here, and that would normally be common land that they would play on or whatever, and that's just closed off. So it's a bit of a waste of resources, really, and a bit of an eyesore as well. On the plus side of it, it meant that the house prices were cheap when we bought here. So it was financially advantageous for us to buy here, to be fair. But I suppose now the worry is not knowing what's going to happen with them, whether they're going to be knocked down, whether they're going to be taken over by another developer, or whether they're going to become social housing. So we don't know what the situation is.
There's no information on that?
No. I mean, apparently the developer has taken, because there was 2 developers involved, and one developer's bought the other one out. And at the beginning of the year they said, these will be completed within the next 6 months, but as you can see, nothing's been done since. But in terms of it bothering my mood in the general day-to-day sense, no, not really, because as I say, I was aware of the situation before I moved in, so it doesn't really affect me that much, to be fair.
Het is voor omwonenden niet bepaald een mooi uitzicht. Maar wie zijn nou de echte slachtoffers van de spookwijken?
There are probably 2 main groups that have been affected. The first group is the group that bought houses between 2000 and 2007, and that's a generation that would have been, say, around 30 when they bought, or late 20s, and now, say, 10 years later, they're maybe in their early 40s, and a lot of those are in, or late 30s, early 40s, and a lot of those are in negative equity. Their house is worth less than their mortgage, so they're stuck in their housing. And if they lose their job and their mortgage doesn't, with their value of the house doesn't cover the mortgage, they're doubly trapped. They can't sell the house, but they can't stay in the house either. So that's one group, and that's a couple of 100,000 households face that. Out of a country that only has maybe 1.7, 1.8 million households, maybe 200,000 to 300,000 households face that problem. The other group, which may be even more badly affected, are the group a decade younger than them. So the people who were in their 20s in 2007 rather than in their 30s in 2007. Those people, particularly the younger group, just as they were finishing college, they had entered college with a certain idea of what the prospects would be when they left college. And often they have skills that were completely not suited to a crisis economy. And the worrying bit is that if you face that early scarring in the labour market, you never recover in the same way somebody who starts work when times are good, they go on a different path completely. Nobody really profited because it was effectively destruction of wealth. So you have this much liabilities and this much in wealth, and then the wealth gets destroyed. And then what happens to the liabilities? And they're the people, if anyone benefited compared to what could have happened, it's the people who lent the money. In particular, European banks who lent to Irish banks. The Irish banks were completely destroyed, taken over by the state, and they're still going, so people still have their jobs in banks. But the shareholders of Irish banks, they were all wiped out. The shareholders and deposit holders in European banks who lent to Irish banks, they got all their money back. Now they would have expected to have got their money back, but of course when the crisis happened, that wasn't guaranteed. So the people who have been affected least are probably people elsewhere in Europe and indeed elsewhere in the world.
Het probleem heeft dus bijna alleen maar slachtoffers. De grote vraag is wie dan de daders zijn. Wie is er schuldig aan die duizenden leegstaande huizen?
Who's to blame for the ghost states? It's a good question. So there has been a bit of a blame game gone on, and it's you could blame the bankers for loaning out the money. You could blame the developers for seeking developments that made no sense. You could blame the government for not putting in regulation both on the finance and on the planning. So it's not a simple this one group is to blame. There's actually a mix of different groups to blame.
Well, I'm probably a bad person to ask that question because I've many faults, but I'm not a big blamer. As to say, certain things happen, in the world, and I'm not being flippant about this because I personally have felt the pain of all of this, like so many other thousands of people. But these kind of things happen. It happened to the Scots, the canniest, probably most, if I say, frugal and provident people, along with your own countrymen in the world. It happened in Holland. It happened to the tulip bubble, the South Seas bubble, etc. So, countries like that who are sort of the foundation of, indeed, modern economics, Adam Smith, and banking and investment, etc., they got sucked into things as well. So these things do happen.
Ultimately, I think the biggest element of blame needs to go actually on the lending side. So what were the standards the banks were employing to decide whether or not to lend to a developer when they say, I'm going to build an estate in this town? Did they say, is this sustainable in the long run? And similarly, the regulators, both at Irish level and at EU level, at EU level, there was no preparation for what a single currency would mean in terms of smaller economies and more peripheral economies, which had never been able to borrow. Irish banks had never been able to borrow on the international capital markets, but as soon as they became part of the Eurozone, they were able to borrow almost infinitely. So they had no experience of how to handle so much credit. And this should have been something that you could have spotted ahead of time. At EU level, when we bring in the euro, banks in certain countries will be able to access funds in a way they've never been able to access them before. So what guidelines will we have in place? But even if that didn't happen at the European level, it should have been also possible to do it at the Irish level, to say no lending in Ireland will take place without the following guidelines. So I would actually see most of the blame there. because the politicians can say, look, build here and you won't pay any taxes or whatever. But unless you can borrow against that, it might not happen.
What do you think should happen to the houses? Is there a solution? Which one would you prefer if there's multiple?
If I was to be really selfish about it, then I could say, well, just knock them down and leave the estate as it is, because there's a good balance of people here, and you know, there might be too many people here if you occupy those places. But from an unselfish point of view and a logical point of view, I'd like to see the houses used, because it just seems a waste, especially when there are people who are in inadequate housing around the country. To have houses just sitting there that could just be finished and put people in them just seems, again, like a waste of resources.
It's very tough to see one solution as being able to turn those ghost estates into estates that are in use. Even though the population of Ireland is growing, it's growing in and around the cities more than in the rural areas. One thing though that Ireland is quite good at, as part of all the investment it attracts in, the investment projects, there are what are known as back office projects. So these would be the admin functions of financial services or pharmaceuticals or medical devices. And they don't need to be in or close to the major cities. And often in Ireland they're not. They're in the slightly smaller towns. Now, if we can effectively offer those projects what is almost free accommodation for their workers, and typically you'll find there's lots of empty office space in these areas as well. If you're taking out the mortgage and rent costs from the cost base of one of these projects, perhaps that's one way of bringing jobs to these areas. And when you bring jobs to the areas, that's when you bring housing demand. But there are probably some that at this stage have deteriorated so much that it may be worth less to restore them to a condition where they're being used, then it may be preferable instead to actually demolish some of them.